Okay, so we'll begin today's Q&A session. First question that is not a question. Hi, this is not a question. And no need to mention it during the retreat. Oh wait, okay. But I will mention it because they wanted to praise Ajahn Kasapo. So, deep gratitude for his answers. He mentioned some very wise things I'm still reflecting on. Sadhu. Unfortunately, Ajahn Kasapo is not here to receive that praise. Please tell us what direction will Lungpor be doing his Tudong. I have no idea of any Tudong Lungpor might be doing. I think the last Tudong he did was 21 years ago, and don't think he'll be doing it again. So, no Tudong for Lungpa. He will be traveling to Thailand in December. Maybe that's why you thought he was going to go Tudong. What are some strategies you can identify for self-compassion? This is often more difficult than compassion for others. I think if you don't have compassion for yourself, it'll be very difficult to have compassion for others. Generally, the way we relate to ourselves will be similar to the way we relate to others. It might seem like we have compassion for others, but if we don't really have compassion for ourselves, it's doubtful that we actually have compassion for others. So, and there is a problem with the word compassion. The English word compassion literally means to suffer with, which is not what we're trying to do with karuna. Karuna is different than that, and it's the wish for others to be free, wish for ourselves to be free from suffering, and the wish for others to be free from suffering. When we suffer because somebody else is suffering, it doesn't take any of their suffering away. It just makes double suffering because now there's two sufferings. So is that karuna? Is that compassionate? Is that going to help the person who's suffering if we suffer also? So the wish for others to be free from suffering. This is a very wholesome mental state. Compassion for ourselves. This is also metta for ourselves. May I be happy. Compassion for ourselves would be, may I be free of suffering. There's no real how. You kind of have to link it with wisdom. We have to see how we aren't compassionate to ourselves. Are there ways in which we're wishing ourselves suffering? When we can see that, we can address it directly. So sometimes it's not going to work. In fact, much of the time it won't work just to recite those phrases, may I be free of suffering, may I be free of suffering. But actually seeing where we don't wish ourselves well, where we don't wish ourselves freedom from suffering, and addressing that. Maybe there's some sort of, we feel selfish, or there's some sort of idea, some sort of abuse, some sort of trauma that's keeping us from wishing ourselves well. So it's really a question that can only be answered by oneself, by yourself, based on the situation, based on how you aren't having compassion for yourself. What's the difference between relinquishment, patinisaga, and renunciation, nekama? Thank you. So you only want to know the difference. You don't want to know how they're the same. So they're very similar, I think. These Pali terms are always open to interpretation. The important thing is that we learn how to let go. So patinisaga has a lot of important meanings associated with it. It's the 16th step of Anapanasati. Patinisaga, it means forfeiting, relinquishing, giving back. Ajahn Buddhadasa would describe it as we give back, we give everything back, like we've had everything on loan. Everything that we thought was ours was just on loan, and so we give it back. We don't consider it ours anymore. That's patinisaga. So giving back is a good translation of patinisaga. Nekama is sometimes translated as renunciation. It's defined as thoughts of non-sensuality in terms of like keeping the mind in, the mind not going out to the sense bases, like Ajahn Kurunadhamma was speaking of this morning. So they probably have more similarities than differences. It's kind of like metta and karuna. There's a difference in emphasis, but they're pointing to the same thing. Metta being the wish for oneself and others to be happy, karuna being the wish for oneself and others to be free of suffering. They're kind of the same thing, but there's a difference in emphasis. Patinisaga is really associated with not self also. It's the things we mistakenly took for self and we're giving them back, we're forfeiting them. We took them to be ours. They weren't really ours to begin with. So we're forfeiting them, we're giving them back. Giving them back to nature. This kind of tangentially touches on a reflection I had today, thinking about Sakkaya Ditthi, the quality that's relinquished at the point of stream entry. And it's translated as personality view, personality belief. Of course, this quality of Sakkaya Ditthi, the relinquishment of it, is actually connected with the realization of anatta, or at least the first seeing of anatta. But we normally think of that in association with ourselves. So we might think, well, this body, this mind is not self, but then we still hold grudges, we still get irritated with people, we still get heavy-hearted. I think, well, I've seen not self. But not self also, it extends to others as well. So as long as we're defining other people, they are this way, they are that way, we have fixed perceptions of other people, I would say Sakkaya Ditthi has not been relinquished yet. So it's not just a fixed perception of ourselves, but it's also if we have fixed definitions and fixed perceptions of others. So when somebody asked Luang Por Sumedho, what's the most skillful way to live in community? His answer was, don't define each other. So fixed perceptions, fixed definitions, that lack of openness, that's also Sakkaya Ditthi, and that's non-Pali patinisaga, and that's non-nekama as well. So sometimes we can understand these things through different reflections, not looking at it directly. Nekama is also one of the paramis, renunciation parami. So are we able to give things up? Are we able to go without? Are we able to go without what we want? Sometimes the Buddha talks about not getting what one wants is dukkha, and being in contact with what one doesn't want is dukkha. But then we forget about that and we still suffer. And we still suffer when we don't get what we want, and we wonder why. And it's because of a lack of this quality of nekama. We aren't able to be okay until we get what we want. But if we're able to relinquish what we want through mindfulness, clear awareness, then we're said to have nekama parami, where we can be okay when things aren't ideal, when we're not surrounded by just the people we like and not the people we don't like. And really, it's always going to be that way, so we might as well just develop that parami now, because we aren't going to be able to get into an ideal situation anytime soon, if ever. So that's a very important parami to be developing. How does one stay caring but not affected by the other person's kilesa? Is it possible that a person can be dragged down by another person's kilesa? Yes, it is possible that a person can be dragged down by another person's kilesa, and it's also possible that we have kilesas that we don't see, and we're dragging others down with our own kilesas and we don't realize it. More often than not, we're externalizing these things and projecting. And in some of the newer studies in linking Dhamma and psychology, I'm reading this book right now that is, it's quite good. It's by a top relationship therapist. And he's kind of had this insight, and I think it's true, that every problem in our relationships that we're blaming others for, we're completely responsible for them. So I'll repeat that. Every problem in our, in our relationships, say it's a friendship or a marriage, any problem in our relationship that we're blaming the other person for, we are completely responsible for that. So that's a very radical way of seeing things. And then the flip side is true too. So any problem the other person has with us that they're blaming us for, they are completely responsible for that. So this really empowers us. If we keep saying we're waiting for the other person to change, it's not going to happen. But we're empowered to change ourselves. If we take responsibility for any problems we might have in a relationship, and if it's an abusive relationship or there's physical abuse, one should just get out of that relationship as soon as possible. But if it's something that we want to make work, such as a marriage or some sort of friendship that we want to make work, or a relationship in the monastery that we want to make work, then we have to actually courageously take responsibility for that relationship. And this is very, very important. So instead of saying, well, it's the other person's defilements, but it's not mine, I have nothing to do with it, then there's nothing we can do about that relationship. It's not going to get better. It's always going to be unsatisfactory. It's always going to just stay the same. And it'll always be that feeling that, well, I'm just a victim of being the recipient of this other person's kilesas. But then that moment we take the shift and we open up to that person. And for anybody who's ever studied nonviolent communication, this is also very similar. The moment we take that step and we go to that other person and we use a disarming technique in order to go up to them and completely agree with them, and do it in a very genuine way, so that when the next time we're the recipient of their kilesas, then we can go up to them in a very genuine way. If it's fake or superficial or contrived, it won't work. It has to be very genuine. And then what can happen is the other person gets disarmed by that. So we say, well, I can see how you're right. So find some truth in what they're saying. I see how you're right. And then from then on, that gives them a bit of a opening to speak. And then when we show genuine empathy, chances are the relationship flips, and it can flip quite quickly. It doesn't even need months or years of therapy. And I've tried this a little bit myself. It's quite good. So that's a suggestion to not saying the other person doesn't have kilesas, but it's saying we can't do anything about it until we actually take responsibility in our own way, and then that empowers us to make a wholesome change. But more often than not, people don't like to hear this. So, but I have to say it because it's good medicine. Okay, now some questions from our side here. Hi, Ajahn. What goes through the mind of an arhat when he sees a beautiful girl? Is he aware that she is beautiful by conventional standard? You probably don't want to know the answer to that one. I don't know, should I answer it? He doesn't see bodies as beautiful. I guess I could leave it at that. What is the difference of dukkha, vedana, and suffering? How do we manage them? Dukkha means suffering, so what's the difference between suffering and suffering? Dukkha is like suffering, unsatisfactoriness. Vedana is feeling. So feeling can be pleasant, painful, or neutral. And suffering, dukkha, the most common translation of dukkha is suffering. So managing them, dukkha is just something that arises and we reflect on. It's the First Noble Truth. And managing dukkha, that's the whole practice. We want to gain insight into dukkha. We want to do more than just cope with it or manage it, but we want to actually overcome it through the Noble Eightfold Path. And vedana is feeling. Feeling is when we have pleasant feeling, we want more of it. When we have painful feeling, we want to get away from it. When we have neutral feeling, we might get deluded or bewildered by it. So those feelings are going to come up. We have very little control over this. So managing them, if manage means, control. We can't control these things. They're not self. So they arise based on causes and conditions. Yeah, this question is very similar to the kind of being subject to another person's kilesas, and it's about somebody creating harm by their way of speech or body language, and so making me suffer. Yeah, I would say in the level of Dhamma, or the level of practice, nobody can actually make us suffer in terms of the dukkha in the mind. Though, of course, there can be a lot of, you get physically attacked or something. Of course, it's going to be very, very difficult unless you're at a very advanced level to not suffer over that. But in the monastery, things get a bit more subtle, so we project onto others, and we might think, somebody rolls their eyes or looks in the wrong way or makes a little bodily gesture that we think is aggressive, and we read into it, and that's a quality known as projection in psychology. So we project onto others that they're making us suffer, and probably even doing it intentionally. They're intentionally making me suffer. And so really the way to have samakhi or harmony in the community is to be very, very forgiving with one another. Chances are that person who is quote unquote making us suffer isn't even aware of that, and didn't mean anything by their actions. Or if they did, still we can take responsibility for the way we feel about it, rather than externalizing it and blaming someone else for it. So blame is it's always the easy way out. It's really difficult to actually take responsibility for our own feelings and our own suffering. And yet, that's integrity when we're able to do that. That's real integrity when we're able to, rather than go into irritation or being hurt or feeling sad that somebody is, say, using wrong speech with us or harmful speech with us. Rather than do that, if we reflect on our own suffering, usually what the result is compassion and a wish that, that person must have spoken like that because they're suffering. That person must have acted like that because of some suffering they're undergoing. And then may they be free of that suffering. So that's karuna, that's compassion. But then if we say things like, that other person has a lot of defilements and I'm trying to have brahmaviharas for them, but to have brahmaviharas for that person is really difficult. That's about the same as saying, like, that person's pretty awful. Like, they're pretty hopeless. And it's quite, there can be quite a lot of sense of self in that, in thinking like that. And so to take responsibility for our own feelings, our own suffering, that's where we can work, and that's where we can make a difference. All is impermanent. What is the best advice to prepare maranasati, death, contemplation, death preparation? Is it true that what you think of before that time comes, that thoughts will bring you for the next life? Partly. I think it's more about our built-up practice, our built-up wholesome qualities over a lifetime is going to condition the the next life through the death process. And yes, the kind of mental state right at the end will be a big conditioning factor, but that mental state itself will be conditioned by our whole life. And if we've led a Dhamma life, we've led a life of cultivating wholesome qualities and letting go of unwholesome qualities, taking responsibility for our own suffering, our own feelings, cultivating sati sampajanya, and made it habitual over a long period of time. And I know Longpa's voiced this story a few times, the story of Mahanama, who was actually the one who took over the governance of the Sakyans after everyone else who could take over governance ordained with the Buddha. And he himself was also a disciple of the Buddha, but still a layman, and I believe a Sotapanna streamager. And he came to the Buddha one time and said, well, he's kind of like getting a bit worried because he knows he could die any time. He does a lot of death contemplation, but sometimes he's going through the market, he's distracted, and he's thinking about all sorts of work he has to get done. And he thinks, well, what if I died while my mind was distracted by thinking about the things I have to purchase, the work I have to do, the chores I have to complete? What if I died at that moment? Would I die confused? And the Buddha said, well, no, you wouldn't, because it's more about the wholesome qualities you've already cultivated. So he said, the Buddha gives this analogy of the two pots. So he says, imagine if you had habitually cultivated unwholesome qualities, you'd be like a pot with rocks in it thrown into the ocean. And when that pot with rocks in it is thrown into the ocean and it sinks to the bottom and breaks, then the rocks just stay at the bottom. So the mind here being like the rocks that stay at the bottom, the mind that's unwholesome. But for a mind that's cultivated wholesome qualities, you're like a pot filled with oil thrown into the ocean. When the pot sinks to the bottom and breaks, the oil can only go one direction. It can only go up. So it doesn't matter if that pot gets thrown about by waves or moved about by fish as it's sinking in the ocean. When it hits the bottom and breaks, that oil can only go up. So he said that's like your mind can only go up at the time of death when you've cultivated wholesome qualities. So whatever we habitually cultivate, that's going to be probably the main factor. Then there might be other environmental factors or circumstantial factors, but they're not going to be as big as that factor of how we've lived our lives. And on the flip side to that, you can see if anybody here has ever done hospice work or worked with dying people, if you try to teach them Buddhism right at the end and they haven't practiced in their life, it doesn't work. They can't learn something new at that point. It's like the story of Paul Breiter wanting to, when he disrobed, he told Luang Por Chah he wanted to go do hospice work and teach dying people about Buddhism. And so this famous story of Luang Por Chah pushing Paul Breiter over onto the ground and taking his cane and jabbing it into his chest as hard as he could and pushing down with his weight and then saying, okay, Bud, breathing in, Bud, breathing out, toe, Bud, toe, Bud, and he's And so it's like, okay, so you're gonna teach dying people Buddhism. He said it doesn't work like that. You have to teach them. They have to have cultivated previously and earlier in their lives to have that foundation. And when it's made habitual, then yes, at the time of death, it can be of great benefit. There's a text that came in. Would you like to be able to share the name and author of the book on relationships? And I was actually thinking while I was answering that question to name it, but I can't recall right now at this moment the name of the author, but maybe I could give it to Kathy and she can share it. I'm still working through it. It's really very well done. he actually, the author, he quotes this, he quotes in the book some guy who is considered to be one of the top marriage counselors in the world, actually. And this guy has been studying marriage counseling, doing marriage counseling for decades. And he said, based on all my knowledge and experience, I can say that we don't yet have a technique or a form of marriage counseling that we can actually say works. And so they're still kind of like trying to develop this, but that's why this book is interesting, because he links it with a lot of these Dhamma ideas. And the Buddha talked a lot about harmony, about how to have good relationships with others. There's even these phrases in the suttas, like the Dhammacetiya Sutta, where King Pasenadi goes to the Buddha later in his life, and he's bows to the Buddha, and the King Pasenadi is the same age as the Buddha, so they're both 80 in this particular sutta. And then King Pasenadi gets down, bows, and he's stroking the Buddha's feet and kissing the Buddha's feet. And the Buddha says, "Why are you doing such homage to this skin bag?" He said, "Why are you doing such amazing homage to this fathom-long skin bag?" And King Pasenadi says, "Because I have these 10 reasons that I pay homage to Buddha Dhamma Sangha." And one of them is, he says, is that here he sees wife quarreling with husband, husband quarreling with wife, mother quarreling with father, children quarreling with mother, children quarreling with father, relatives quarreling with relatives, friends quarreling with friends, brothers quarreling with sisters. But here I see the monastics, the bhikkhus in the monastery here, looking upon each other with kindly eyes, smiling out of delight in the Dhamma, and blending like milk and water without quarreling. And this is one of the reasons I pay homage to Buddha Dhamma Sangha. And so like this idea of samakhi, but where does that come from? So there's another sutta where the 3 Anuruddhas, there's these 3 monks practicing together, and the Buddha goes to see them and asks, "How are you guys doing?" And they say, "Yeah, we're blending like milk and water." And the Buddha asks, "How are you blending like milk and water?" And they say, "Well, when I think I'd like to do this, but then the other one says, well, I'd like to do that, then I think, well, I'll let go of what I want to do, and we'll do what the other one wants to do." And then they all have that attitude, and so they blend like milk and water. They just flow together, and at the end they say, "We are 3 in body, but 1 in mind." And so there's that shared sense of purpose.